Okay. Thank you, everybody. It's really good to be with you. I'll try and be to 15 minutes. If I go a bit longer, I'm conscious that it's only me that's between you and the questions, and more importantly, the food. Has science eliminated God? If you look at some things on the web, you'd think that the battle is over and done with. The sort of things that say science is to religion as sunlight is to a vampire when it's gone. Or maybe the schoolboys, schoolgirls poster, science is God's way of telling you that he doesn't exist. Think carefully about that. Is that true? Is science in conflict with religion, with the Christian faith in particular? Do we have to give up? Some people will view it that science, what is it? You're presumably mainly scientists, engineers, mathematicians, whatever. At Bath, I'd expect that. Science, what is it? It's objective, it's rational, it's accurate, it's quantifiable. And the perception of religion, or faith in particular, well, it's subjective, it's emotional, it's unprovable. It's something that just makes you feel good, isn't it? Is that really the case? The battle over science and religion, some people give the impression it's over and done with. Here's Andrew White at the top there. Andrew White was an American philanthropist, an atheist, founder of Cornell University. And he talks about, this is in the 19th century, the noble armies of science with its banners of light and truth fighting against the dark hordes of dogmatic theology, blinded by prejudice and resistant to progress. Science is going to move us forward. Religion and faith is just passé. And John Draper, another American, talks about the history of science really being the battle between the human intellect and the traditional faiths. Is that really the case? What is faith, after all? Mark Twain, I think, was the one who said, if you like, the schoolboy howler, what is faith? It's believing in something that you know isn't true. And you get the likes of Richard Dawkins amplifying that in his own way. Faith, he says, is the great cop-out, the excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. That's what scientists play with all the time. Faith is belief in spite of, even perhaps because of the lack of evidence. Faith is not allowed to justify itself by argument. And there is, if that's correct, there's an immediate rub with science. So science is to do with evidence and interpretation of evidence and rationality. And he's saying that science, the more evidence you've got, the less faith that there is. Science is concerned with facts. Religion deals with opinions, some people say. And the late Christopher Hitchens, one of the most vociferous of the new atheists, talks about all attempts to reconcile faith with science are consigned to ridicule and failure. So some people's view of faith is an unscientific one. It's like Alice in Wonderland with the Queen, believing 6 impossible things to do before breakfast. It's what you might call a homeopathic view of faith. Rather, homeopathic medicines, you dilute them, and the less there is there, the more powerful it is. Some people's view of faith is that. The less evidence there is, the more faith there is, and the more evidence, well, there's no need for faith, is there? So we can do away with belief. I want to say that's poppycock, that faith is trust. And it's trust on the basis of the evidence that's there. The Christian faith particularly has always been based on rational thought. If you read the sorts of things that are going on in the Gospels and in Acts, Paul is reasoning and debating and arguing with the people all the time. He's not saying put your brain on ice. It's use your brain, use the scientific evidence. So Alistair McGrath of Oxford University says, indeed, the Christian tradition is so strong on this matter, it's difficult to understand quite exactly where Richard Dawkins gets his ideas from. Some people say, well, faith is to do with superstition, isn't it? Rather like vampires. I like Voltaire's quote, that superstition is to religion what astrology is to astronomy. Right? They're not related. It's the mad daughter, he puts it, of a wise mother. And you might think that the more science we have, the less superstition there is in society, and that religion is to do with those quackery type of things. But the statistics, and this is the American Pew Foundation statistics, comparing people's beliefs in the 1950s to now. In the 1950s, 10% of people believed in ghosts. Now, 39% of people do. 7% believed in tarot cards, 15% now. 6% in astrology, 22% now. Now, that's Americans. So that may not be quite true of a UK audience. But that doesn't say that the more scientific we get, the more rational society becomes. In fact, sometimes quite the opposite. The less religious we become, the more superstitious we become. I think it was Chesterton who said when people stop believing in God, they don't believe in nothing, they believe in anything. But science has told us a lot, hasn't it, that you don't read in the scriptures. Whether it's the wonders of the universe, the Big Bang, the origin of species, these are things that the writers of the ancient scriptures could not have conceived of. So are they a challenge to faith? Well, they're a challenge to certain versions of faith. That cartoon parodying the person who thinks that you have to believe six-day creation, the earth only 6,000 years old. Clearly, that is that sort of belief is at variance with science. Science says that the universe is 13.8 billion years old. The Earth itself, 5 billion years old, and so on through. That sort of faith is against the scientific evidence and against faith, really. But does the fact that we understand something about the world, how old it is, how it functions, does that say anything about the existence or the non-existence of God? Quite clearly, it doesn't. God is God, whether I understand what he has done or not. Think about that for a moment. If I don't understand him, he can be God. If I do understand it, it just says a little bit more about what I understand, nothing more about God. So science and religion are not actually rival descriptions of the way the world works. They're complementary descriptions. Religion isn't a bad form of proto-science. It's a different way of looking at the world that the Christian says that God has made over eons of time, and that we're exploring what he has done. You may be familiar with the story of Laplace with his planetary motions, and he wrote his book on that and presented it to Napoleon. And Napoleon is reputed to have said words to the effect of, "But there's no mention of God in your book." And Laplace replies, "I've no need of that hypothesis." That wasn't to say that Laplace said he's an atheist, but that you don't need to invoke God to understand the physical laws of the universe. The scientist, who's a Christian when they go in the lab, does the same experiments, gets the same results as the non-Christian scientist who goes into the lab. You don't need to invoke God in order to be able to get a scientific result. We live in a consistent, coherent universe. The other example is rather like Frank Whittle. He was the inventor of the jet engine. You could look at the jet engine and understand its physics, its engineering, its mechanics. You could take it to pieces. You can experience a jet engine, but you'd never find Frank Whittle. But the fact that you wouldn't find him in a jet engine is not evidence that Frank Whittle didn't exist. He certainly did, and developed that engineering wonder. So many people have a view of God and science that's actually what we might call the God of the gaps. That God is there to explain the things that I don't understand. If I understand them, God just disappears like the smile on the Cheshire Cat. But if I don't understand them, that's where God goes. That is nonsense, that sort of way of thinking. Because the whole scientific enterprise is based on the assumption that there are gaps and that we're going to fill them. That's what gets me out of bed in the morning. It's what's fun, discovering things. It's what keeps me employed. If we knew everything that we needed to know, there'd be no need for scientists. So the God who fits the gaps is not sufficient. God is God of the whole universe, whether we understand what he is doing or not. Charles Coulson, who was a professor of theoretical chemistry in both London and Oxford universities, put it this way: when we come to the scientifically unknown, our correct policy is not to rejoice because we've found God. It is to become better scientists. So the God of the gaps is indeed dead. We don't believe in that sort of a God. We believe in a God who is over the whole thing, whether I understand what he's doing or not. Can we have a complete scientific explanation of the world, and I emphasize the word scientific explanation of the world, without invoking God? And I think the answer is very clearly yes, of course you can. The non-Christian and the Christian explain the physical, chemical, biological workings of the world in the same way. But that's not to say we can understand everything about life. Peter Medawar, who was a Nobel Prize-winning immunologist, said this: questions about God are about whether there's anything other than nature to which it owes its existence. It's no use going to science, the study of nature, to find out whether there's anything other than nature. That's like chastising a railway engine because it doesn't fly. So scientists can answer lots and lots of questions, but they can't answer the question of why are we here? The sort of questions that maybe children ask. You know, what's the point of this? Can science answer all life's questions? I don't know who was that said it. I can't find the source of it, but the answer to that question is yes, science can answer all life's questions except the really interesting ones. Now, what's the purpose of being here? See, there are various ways of looking at life. Let me give you a few examples. If the kettle is boiling, why is the kettle boiling? It's because there's heat transfer from the element in the kettle that's exciting those molecules in there. They get faster and faster, and the temperature's rising, and steam goes off. That's thermodynamics. It's a very good explanation of why the kettle is boiling. But a deeper explanation of why the kettle is boiling is because I want a cup of coffee. It's two ways of looking at the same thing, both entirely correct. Let me ask you the question as to why are you here today? Well, it could be, your explanation could be in terms of physiology and mechanics, because you got out of bed this morning and the body's metabolism worked and your nerves functioned and the muscles worked and it got you up the hill if you live down in town and so on you got here. It could be you're here, though, because a friend invited you. It could be that you're here because there's good food. It could be that you actually want to take the speaker to... There's all sorts of reasons of why you're here. So on a simple level, and it is a simple level, science asks how and religion asks why. Maybe the why question, like the philosopher Leibniz put it, why is there something rather than nothing? Why does the universe bother to exist? I think as Stephen Hawking put it. Who breathes fire into the equations? We can write down the physics of lots of things that go on, of the Big Bang, of understanding what's going on. But it's more than equations. Who breathes fire into it, as Stephen Hawking says? You see, the history of science, particularly in the Western world, has had Christians underpinning it all the way through. Here are some famous scientists, all of whom were practicing Christians from years gone by. From Michael Faraday with electrochemistry, from Kepler with planetary motions, to Robert Boyle with gas laws, and James Clerk Maxwell with electromagnetism. And we could go on. Kelvin, Francis Collins, the present director of the NIH in the USA. These people felt able to explore nature and to discover how it worked because they believed in a lawgiver, that the world we live in is not capricious, it's not random, it itself has a logic to it because there's a logical mind behind the whole thing. So that encourages them to explore it. And actually, it's not intended to knock other religions, but you'll find that the Christian religion says that the world we live in is worth exploring. It's God's, it's good. As that picture of the Genesis narrative, it was very good. Some other religions say that the thing you should do is just to get away from the world. It's evil and nasty, and so we'll go and contemplate and live in our little caves and seek enlightenment. But no, the Christian faith throws you back into the world. So this is worth looking at. This is worth exploring. Science is a really honourable exercise because it's exploring what God has done. You see, the Christian faith simply says that science is possible. Now, we can do science because there's a logical mind behind it. John Polkinghorne, a famous physicist who, in his mid-50s, I think it was mid-50s, resigned his chair in Cambridge to seek ordination and has been at that science-faith interface for a number of years now. Put it this way: belief in God renders the intelligibility of the universe itself intelligible. It says that the world is shot through with signs of mind precisely because the mind of its creator lies behind that wonderful order. Science itself, you see, is theologically neutral. It can't arbitrate whether God exists or not. It can arbitrate over physical and chemical and biological observations, but it can't say whether God exists. And to quote an evolutionary biologist, Stephen Jay Gould, who died a few years ago, he was quite adamant to say his words, to say it for all my colleagues to the umpteenth millionth time: science simply cannot, by its own legitimate methods, adjudicate the issue of God's possible superintendence of nature. We neither affirm it nor deny it. We simply cannot comment on it as scientists. And Stephen Jay Gould would have classed himself as an agnostic. Compare that with Francis Collins, I've mentioned already, director of the NIH, previously director of the Human Genome Project, talking about how his Christian faith is not in conflict with his science. I read there's no real conflict between a creator God and using science to understand how God had done the creating. I can't imagine that science, he says, which allows us to peer dimly into God's creation, would in some way threaten God. Here's an opportunity, he says, to understand God better and to increase our awe and wonder for what God has done. Now, very quickly, some of the things that science has actually told us that I think point in the direction of a God. You'll be familiar with the fine-tuning of the universe, how the fundamental constants, they have very, very precise values, immensely precise, whether it's the speed of light or the charge on the electron or the ratios of some fundamental forces. And a number of people have written of this. Look at Stephen Hawking writing in A Brief History of Time. These values, the value of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life, he says. And Fred Hoyle, a physicist, who remained an atheist to his dying day, still said of this, a common-sense interpretation of facts suggests that a super-intellect is monkeyed with physics as well as chemistry and biology, and there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates and the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this question, this almost beyond question. The universe we live in is so very finely tuned, and you need an explanation for that. Some will invoke the multiverse in order to do it. A simpler explanation is there is a mind behind that. Paul Davies, again, who will call himself an agnostic. On the face of it, the universe does look as if it's been designed by an intelligent creator expressly for the purpose of spawning sentient beings. That's you and me. Like porridge, he says, in the tale of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, the universe is just right for life in many intriguing ways, and no scientific explanation can be deemed complete unless it accounts for this appearance of design. And to keep on quoting agnostics, just to show that I'm not biasing the chips in my favor, Robert Jastrow puts it this way: for the scientist who's lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He's scaled the mountains of ignorance, he's about to conquer the highest peaks, and as he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who've been sitting there for centuries and saying, this is the way that God did it. You see, these things don't prove God's existence. I can't prove one way or the other whether God exists or not. I can't use science to prove it. I can't use scripture to prove in the way that you have a mathematical proof. But they're entirely consistent with the existence of God. As Augustine, writing back in the 4th century, put it, nature is what God does. The facts of nature are simply the acts of God. To quote a few other people again, Kepler, the astronomer, put his science is thinking God's thoughts after him, discovering the way in which he's made the world tick. And David Attenborough, who would probably call himself an agnostic, described it this way: if there is an Almighty, maybe scientists are just gradually uncovering his method, finding out what God has done. What a privilege for those of you who are or science-based students to be able to do that. So the Christian would say, along with the psalmist, great are the works of the Lord, studied by all who delight in them. That's the scientist, those who study the way that the world works and take delight in it. I hope you do take delight in your studies. Sometimes they're tedious, I know. But it is great fun, science, and finding out the way that the universe ticks and understanding something about the mind of God in doing that. I'll finish there. Thank you.